I do want to introduce our speaker today, Timothy Loney. Timothy is a sociology professor at Vermilion Community College, and twice now has responded in the affirmative to a frantic last-minute request from me to speak at Tuesday Group. So you may recall that Timothy last year, actually June of 2021, gave a very timely presentation on critical race theory. And this particular instance is one that makes me feel extremely grateful. And you know, I always feel grateful, but now I feel extra grateful for Tuesday Group and to live in a town where we have a college. So I think sometimes it's something that we can forget about or take for granted, but to live in a community where you have access to a college and the abundance of resources and wealth of knowledge that comes along with an institution like a community college is just such a gift. And this is a really good example of how we as community members who maybe aren't even paying fees or tuition, and by maybe aren't, I'm definitely not, but I'm so appreciative to be able to benefit from the resources and the insight and expertise of the professors and experts who work at the college. So anyways, a little moment of gratitude for being in Ely, where we have this cool weekly program, and being in Ely, where we have the Vermilion Community College, and for Timothy Loney, who my husband Eric described as maybe the nicest person ever of all time. And generally, we're just so grateful to have Timothy here to help guide us in this kind of very timely, again, moment of learning in community with one another. So just thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Lacey. I'm happy to be back at Tuesday Group and see a lot of familiar faces. It's a lovely place to be, and I'm glad to be welcomed so warmly here. The topic today is talking about school shootings, and since my discipline is sociology, I wanted to do more kind of a sociological, I guess, investigation into school shootings. And there's a lot to uncover. And so it was a hard thing to kind of reel into a short presentation, but I think I pulled it off. We'll see how it is. As we talk about this, we know that many issues are politicized. And so anytime a school shooting happens, depending on what news network you turn on, the discussion is probably greatly different. And so thus kind of the subheader here, guns versus mental health. That tends to be the argument or in debate in some ways when we talk about school shootings, what's to blame. And hopefully at the end of the presentation, we'll have a less dichotomous view of this situation. Part of sociology is actually blending with other disciplines like history. And so taking a socio-historical perspective is key to understanding any kind of key things that are going on. It's particularly in one culture. And so when we look at the United States, where mass shootings, school shootings happen far more frequently than anywhere else in the world, we do need to take kind of a socio-historical cultural view at the United States. And so the main themes for this talk, we're looking at research. What does research tell us? Sociology as a discipline, we like to use science and research and data to drive our thoughts. We have to look at gun culture and policy. And we also have to look at mental health and masculinity. So those are the main themes that we are looking at today when we're looking at school shootings. I want to start with kind of what are the leading narratives out there. Probably heard the first one, guns don't kill people, people kill people. As a leading narrative, what is the focus there? When we turn in, this is more media driven here. When we turn into media, the media discussions tend to be around mental health rather than looking at guns as the source of the problem. And so this argument looks at the idea of people are to blame. And we have to look at who are the people doing the shooting or the killing in this case. It also then leads to this discussion of what's called the lone wolf. Often with mass shootings, despite Columbine and a few other school shootings, in a lot of cases there is one shooter, one person going in. And so that leads to this idea that it's one person, lone wolf, and it leads to the discussion then about mental health and how fixing mental health could have prevented this problem. And we'll talk about some issues with kind of the lone wolf analogy. On the other side, the argument is to ban certain guns, gun restriction. And I put that broadly because I'm not doing an overview of gun policy today. So more broadly, what is the argument? Well, if we ban certain types of guns, that would also limit it. And so in this case, not necessarily denying mental health as the source, but pointing to guns as the problem as they were the weapons used in the shootings. And so the proponents of using this are looking to push policy to prevent, ban certain guns, more restrictions on guns, kind of more broadly in that sense. So again, just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. Another important piece to look at, I'll touch on mass shootings a little bit, but I wanted to start and really focus on school shootings to make this a little bit more clear. And if we're looking at school shootings, we also have to look at the institution of the school. What does it represent? How do we understand it? What meanings does it give to people? We have to look at mental health. We have to look at gun policy. And we also then have to do kind of a criminological analysis of the character profiles of the shooters. Are we going to find patterns within the people that are doing school shootings? So those are the 4 areas that lead to our discussion today. And I hope the people in the back can read it. Tried to make the font big. So when we look at the school, we have to think about what is unique about it. It's a place of socialization. And it's a key piece where people are socialized around people their own age. And so as an institution, it's an important thing to study. And many sociologists have studied the school and education, going back to the founders of sociology in the very beginning. And so when we look at it, we look at the idea that, one, we've changed some things. In response to Columbine and Sandy Hook as just 2 examples, we see that there's been some changes already to schools and how we view schools. Lockdowns, collaboration with police departments, closed circuit cameras, doors that lock automatically, police officers at school, identification badges have increasingly become distinctive. Those are all signs that we've adjusted. Basically, the fact that school shootings have shifted how we view the education and the school itself. And so what does that mean? It means that these changes, the security changes, are reshaping the social ecology of the school and the school's agendas as well. And so if we go back to some other sociologists, what is the purpose of education? A lot of people think purpose of education is maybe develop a critical mindset, learn new skills, but there's many reasons, many purposes of developing kind of an education system. And a lot of it has to do with developing this kind of social ecology or shared social norms. And that's going to lead into our next discussion point. And so with shared social norms, people learn these behaviors. They base it off of each other. In my juvenile delinquency course, we talk about why is juvenile delinquency an important thing to look at? Why is an entire course talking about that? Well, that peer-to-peer socialization. In sociology, we call them agents of socialization. Your family, your peers, the institution of education. For some people, religion is one of those agents of socialization as well. And so within that, it impacts our behavior and it impacts our own understanding of our own identity. Now, in the broader scale, we have to talk about mental health, and we're going to combine these two in the next slide. 20% of adolescents in the United States may experience a mental health problem in any given year. So these are just some statistics to kind of put in the back of our brain as we go through this. 50% of mental health problems are established by age 14. This is more of the psychological components of this, of developing mental health problems. 75% of those are well established by age 24. So this gets at kind of brain development, social development, all of those are key pieces. Now, what else is important is 10% of children and young people aged 5 to 16 have a clinically diagnosable mental problem. 1 in 10. And that's wide ranging. I mean, it doesn't mean it's you know, the severity of it is different, but it's clinically diagnosable, 10%. So 1 in 10 people have something that could be diagnosable, yet 70% of children and adolescents who experience these problems have not had appropriate interventions at a sufficiently early age. So this gets at kind of another large institution, the institution of health. What have we done with mental health? That are we focusing on that for young people, broadly speaking? And we see that the strong majority who are experiencing health problems have not had the appropriate interventions. So within sociology, we have to do micro and macro scale. When we look at politics surrounding mental health, we have to look at policy. We'll look at gun policy as well. So we have to look at mental health policy. We see that education and school policy has shifted. Security has changed. When it comes to mental health, we know that certain policies have shifted things as well. In 1980, Carter's legislation with the Mental Health Act, in 81, this was repealed under the Reagan administration. And what did this do? What it did is it pushed the responsibility of mentally ill patients back to the states. So under Carter's legislation, it was federally supported. Even if these were within state hospitals, it was federally supported by federal tax dollars. As that was repealed, it pushed that back to the state's responsibility. And they created something called block grants for states, but the federal spending on mental illness declined rapidly. What this led to then also is the closure of many state-run mental health facilities because they could not afford it without the federal funding. Basically, they were propped up by federal funding. Removing that means that the states now have to support it. If the states do not have that money, that tax base, those begin to close. So that leads to then more people leaving those mental health facilities. Now, this followed actually a couple decades of psychological advancements and understandings within mental health, where we're making advancements in terms of medicine and research to see how can people that struggle with certain mental health issues live in the same kind of society and function as members of society and contribute as members of society. But removing that funding means that it also made it harder and they were pushed back onto civilian life without the assistance they had before. So how does this relate to all this together? We're kind of building this narrative here. When we look at mass shooters, and the numbers are not very different when we look at school shootings. I believe the number is 94% or right around 96. It's kind of unconfirmed in the data currently. 96% of mass shooters are men. So as a statistical point, that's something we have to investigate. Why would it be men? There's a large history within gun culture, which we'll talk about next in terms of masculinity and guns, in terms of what are guns used for, in terms of protection, hunting, things like that. But we'll get at a little bit more in terms of why is it men turning to violence. Now, kind of a reiteration, schools can be seen as a social entity responsible for the internalization of social values. And so looking at Bordeaux, Durkheim, and some of those values are masculinity. You can think of, if you went to school, bullying was a thing, right? What is kind of the reason behind bullying? When you research juvenile delinquency, violence in young men and bullying, right? A lot of it has to do with this idea of the internalization of one's own masculinity. Proving that to other people. So it's a very important thing. Masculinity is not just an internal part of one's identity, it's something that we also show and put out to the world. And so this role then of the education in terms of the reproduction and preservation of masculinity is an important piece through socialization in that institution. And so what we see then is what happens when young men struggle in school. Jumping outside of mass shootings, people heard about the school to prison pipeline. You heard that phrase before. Okay, so young men, juveniles, young boys, I should say, that are in school and struggling with school in areas where they don't have proper resources, it often leads to them going down a path of juvenile delinquency, which might lead to jail or prison. The idea that struggling in this entity or institution of education leads to them trying to find their place in another place. And so strong research in juvenile delinquency looks at the rise of gangs in some ways. And so where does that happen? Those schools that are not properly funded, where young boys are not doing well in school, they turn to other places where their socialization is felt and their identity is lifted. And so school to prison pipeline looks at when you underfund schools and young boys struggle, they turn outside of school to find their identity because they're not finding their identity within education. And so a consequence of this, the exclusion of individuals, right, and the lack of in recognition here, means that certain people are going to react angrily toward the school, the entity of the school. So I don't know, you can raise your hand, but if you grew up and you struggled in school, how many people had to go to detention at some point in school? Oh yeah, okay. Now, yeah. There's many reasons, and the severity of it could be wide-standing, of course. But a lot of that is a pushback against something that's pushing against you. Maybe you're struggling in school, you didn't like the teacher. It could be a variety of reasons. But because of that, you're pushing back against this institution, fighting against that. Oh, yeah. So, adding to this second page on masculinity and why I'm presenting on this, because it's an important element that's not talked about a lot. When a shooter commits violence against a school, what they're doing is they're attacking this entity. If you look at the recent case in Uvalde, basically targeted people that had no relation. And so that seems really weird. Most gun violence happens because of people know each other, right? Or gang related or things like that. But in this case, right, targeting a school where there's no relations particularly means that what are they attacking? Well, they're attacking something that socially embodies this idea that's attacking their masculinity. And so for young boys, when they're not successful, their own identity is attacked. And as young boys, a large part of your identity is proving your masculinity. And so what happens for why there's the prison to pipeline, part of the mass shootings, part of why even men are doing worse in school now than women, and boys and girls the same way, is that it feels like the system is actually eroding or attacking their masculinity. And so another piece of this when we're looking at the data is that the school shootings happen when there's an audience. And so there's two facts here about the actual shooting itself and where it happens. The need for an audience is important. Just like bullying, right? Bullying tends to happen in front of an audience in a lot of ways. And why is that the case? Well, then the crowd is really what pushes or elite and kind of raises your internalization of masculinity in some ways. The second part of it is that it's random. And so the shootings are commonly random when we're looking at the mass school shootings. And so it's aimed at the entity of the school, not particular individuals, which is a really weird thought, but it's an important piece. And so we have to address the school as a social entity that is being attacked when people are shooting, doing school shootings in that manner. So guns, got to talk about guns. How many gun owners do I have in this room? Okay, a few. Perfect. So 2 decades ago, right, observed that there's nearly 1 gun for every man, woman, and child. And that has basically stayed the same in this country. So that hasn't changed. And so we know that there's a long history of the United States culture in guns. Guns become a part of that culture. And it's varying in a lot of ways. The gun owners that had your hands up, how many of you use your guns for hunting? Okay, expected that in northern Minnesota a little bit. And so guns, there's a wide range of use. How many people like to go to the gun range? Okay, yeah, gun range, go to shoot there. And so there's family ties to that. People that grew up in families that own guns are far more likely to own guns. Kind of makes sense. What your parents use a gun for, you're more likely to do the same in those ways. When it comes to policy, though, gun policy is understudied. We'll talk about that. And so the Dickey Amendment is something we have to talk about, and it's renewed continuously until 2019, so from 1996 to 2019. And what that did is it basically slowed down, removed, and did not build the United States government investment in gun policy research. So from 96 to 2019, we did not properly fund gun policy research. Oops. And so in 2019, $25 million then was implemented to study the idea of gun violence and prevention. What we see is basically a little over 2 decades of not actually funding, studying gun policy. Does it work? And so one issue when we actually debate gun policy is we often don't have enough information on the effectiveness of gun policy. And so this data comes from Rand Corporation, which did a lot of deep diving into gun policy to see what is the effectiveness of gun policy. And so we'll talk about a few of these here. And so they studied 18 different gun policies, and only two came across as supportive in terms of you could actually see that the gun policy had an impact. Those two were child access prevention laws and stand your ground laws. Those are the 2 laws and policies that they could actually find substantive data to see that the gun policy had an impact. And so what they found was supportive evidence that child access prevention laws do in fact reduce firearm self-injuries, including suicides, and unintentional firearm injuries and deaths among children. So statistically significant findings that showed that those laws do in fact make a difference. In addition, they did find supportive evidence that stand your ground laws increase firearm homicides. Now, this is a little tricky because gun laws are different in different states. And so when we look at stand your ground laws, increasing firearm homicides, for some people, that's actually a goal of the policy. Now that sounds weird, but basically justifiable homicides in self-defense. And so part of that is in there in terms of homicides, categorized as homicide. And so some would say that that law is successful in that way, but they did find that it did lead to more firearm homicides. More research needs to be done in terms of the totality of justifiable homicides versus criminally punishable homicides. But those were the two. And so when we think about this, getting funding in 2019, this is all we really have in terms of substantive data on gun policy. Now, when we look at generally, kind of stepping out of our discussion here, mass shootings in the United States, the mass shootings definition has changed over time too, so that's a little tricky. But what we're looking at is the original definition until 2013 was shootings in a public place in which 4 or more victims were killed. In 2013, the definition was changed. The threshold was lowered to 3 victims. But what is this graph showing? One argument is the idea that banning guns works. Now, this shows that, and this is in relation to the assault weapon ban under the Clinton administration that was removed in 2004. And so if we look at it, from the mid-90s to 2004, we do see a large growth in mass shootings after the assault weapon ban was removed. Now, from the same RAND Corp that was doing the research, they did show that there is a correlation, obviously, to that shows inclusive evidence that there's a causal link. But the problem is that assault weapons, I got to retype that one, sorry, but one issue with this is that assault weapons are used in 16% of mass shootings. And so even though mass shootings increased, the amount of mass shootings that use assault weapons is 16%. So it was hard then to draw an actual causal link to see, did the ban actually make an impact? And so in their research, it was inconclusive. Sorry, it says inclusive. It's supposed to say inconclusive. My apologies there. And so there's inconclusive evidence that there's a causal link, even though that there is strong correlation there. And that is due to the fact that 16% of mass shootings use assault weapons. So then we also have to define what is a school shooting. And this is another important element to our discussions of school shootings. And this comes from the Center for Homeland Defense and Security that is doing more research about school shootings and mass shootings. And their definition that is used, and then I'll use their data as well. Anytime a gun was brandished, fired, or a bullet landed on school property, any time of day, regardless of the reason. And this also includes zeros, and what zeros are means no gunshots fired, but gun was brandished also includes school buses. So school property also includes school buses. This data also includes the idea that a gun was present, but a shot was not fired. So when we look at school shootings, often we just kind of generalize it. School shootings are going up, or this is what's leading to school shootings. And so what we want to do is break down that data to have a better understanding. What we know is about 31% are dispute or grievance related. And so that means they're conflict driven. So these school shootings are conflict driven. Basically, purposeful intent is often in those rulings as well. That can include gang-related violence as well. And so 31%, the largest subsection of this. 16% is accidental. So someone brought a gun to school and then there was an accidental discharge of the gun. Now, what I've talked about so far in our conversations of school shootings falls under this 14%, school targeted. And that's the cases that often get the headlines that we see where people go in, target the school, and more of the mass shooting type style. And so that's targeted towards the structures of the entity itself. And so 14%. There's a lot of other that fall in here in terms of there's an own category for domestic related gun firing, unknown target or intent. So there's some data that is inconclusive there as well. Suicide attempt makes up 11%. Targeted victim, but they don't know the relationship, makes up 7%. Related to other illegal activities, often drug related. And then there's an other category as well. And so in our conversations of talking about the school being targeted, I just wanted to be clear that that's talking about 14%. And there's a large portion that is unrelated to that. But why it's unique to talk about this is that when we think about school shootings, what's rising is that case, the school targeting. And so when we look at data from the past, it wasn't really related to this until we get into post, Columbine. Columbine and post is really where we see the rise of the school targeted type school shootings. So I have some graphs to look at in terms of school shootings since 1970. And really what I want you to see is the relationship between modern day shootings versus previously. And so this data goes all the way back to 1970. And so this chart shows school shootings since 1970. This chart shows school shootings since 1999. And this chart shows school shootings since 2009. And so to jump back a little bit, what we're seeing more and more of in recent years, and the graph I don't have right now is actually very close to this, doesn't change much, but school shootings since 2018 does not change much.
What's the color code?
So the color code, I'll get to that and what that's relating to is the type. So basically previously looking at this, it's weird because the person that published this changed the color system for some reason, but so I'm sorry about that, but that is large. It's actually mostly correct. It's just there's a couple of colors that look different on the graph than in the chart. But what that's referring to is the different types. And so is it a suicide attempt? Is it school related? Is it gang related? Is it domestic? Those are the different colors that we would find there. Thank you for asking.
What is the gang related?
The dispute, that's the, and so that's where that got weird because it's one of the blues. Yeah, so that was one that was like, oh, that didn't really, so.
The size of the circle of number of fatalities?
Yes. And so, really what I wanted to get to show that is that it has been increasing. And so it is another one of those when we talk about timely events, talk about incidents by year has been growing. And so the incidents by year is on the top, we have victims per year on the bottom. And pretty standard moving up by 25. And what we see is since I guess you could include 2016 in there, but 2018 leading to today, a massive increase in school shootings. And where you see a large difference, right? You see some blips in here in terms of the blue is killed, and that's what I'm going to focus on here. There's a few blips, but getting more and more consistent by year in terms of the amount of people killed. And we see the amount of incidents increasing as well. And so the wounded, the yellow is minor injuries, and green is no injuries. And now, why are the green lines so long? That's kind of a good question to ask. That's because the school targeted shootings have increased so much that so many more people were affected by it. Whereas other types of shootings might happen on a bus, might happen off the ground, like outside of the school, actually 51% of school shootings happen outside of the actual building itself. And that has a lot to do with the other types of shootings. Obviously, the school targeted shootings happen inside the school. And so when we look at no injuries, it's also looking at people that were affected and directly in contact with it. And that does increase the severity of it as well. So then what I wanted to jump to is a criminological profile of the school targeted shooters. So not looking at gang related shooting, but looking more at what happens when someone goes in as a school targeted shooter. Basically, no relation to who they're shooting, that doesn't matter, it's an attack against the entity. What we do see in the strongest causal link is the history of severe mental illness. And so mental health is the largest predictor of school shootings. Now, I want to be very clear here. A lot of people suffer with mental health. And so when we're looking at the actual criminological profiles, it's also mental illness that includes previous signs of physical violence, as well as it's often untreated. And I want to be clear on that because sometimes the argument gets at mental health, mental health, mental health. But most people that suffer from mental health illness are not violent towards other people. And so when we pair that with a history of physical violence, that's a much stronger signifier that in terms of the profile of the shooters. Additionally, young men. And so why is that important? Like we talked about in terms of masculinity, and I'll get to that kind of at the end here. Isolation. One of the other problems that there's no causal link yet, but when we look at the idea of COVID, isolation increased for a lot of people. Pressures to conform, we've all been through that, and then also the stigma around mental health. And so when we look at that, young boys and girls are resistant to seek out mental health. Now, it is getting better in some ways, and so I'll point to Cass and thank you for participating in that and having organizations that increase awareness around mental health and increase also opportunities for people to seek that out. And as long as we can reduce that stigma, people can seek out mental health professionals earlier. And what we know is the earlier that we treat these things with the data from previous slides, far more likely that it does not lead to more severity in the future as well. We also have to point to easy access to guns. This is another contributing factor, often with mass shootings and with school targeted shootings. The access to guns is actually most often through family members, just the availability of guns in the home. But there's also some states that the waiting period doesn't exist, I guess I would say it that way. And so it's often through family members, the availability of guns that way. We talked about kind of the child protection laws and things like that, but also the ability to purchase without a waiting period is another strong factor here when we look at the actual profile. Now, the other piece that is really important and timely when we look at kind of the socio-historical model of this is learning from previous incidents. And so in criminology, we call it copycat crimes. It's unfortunate, but school shootings is probably the best representation of copycat crimes. They saw how that was. And a lot of it has to do with, and this is where masculinity is really important, how were they portrayed in the media? And they had their picture up, they were talked about, the ego is a big part of that. And so they saw that, oh, you know, I'm not being parts of that kind of internalization, you know, no one's paying attention to me, people are bullying me, these things. Well, guess what? Now they'll pay attention to me because, you know, look at what happened with Columbine, look at what happened with Sandy Hook. And so copycat crimes, if they see that it was successful in terms of their desired outcome. And then lastly, what we see is that I talked about agents of socialization before, the internet. And so the internet and media has become one of the strongest agents of socialization where people start to begin to form their identities. And so What's really unique from a sociological sense is that our culture is no longer geographically bound. We are able to draw from anywhere around the world to basically get our information and build up our own identity that way. A side note, but related, when I teach about religion, it's very similar. We see that there's a trajectory of people being more spiritual than religious. And those that are more religious have a strong identity and affiliation to the church, the entity of the church, the institution that way. Whereas people becoming more spiritual, it's more of the individualized process. It's not necessarily related to that. And so what we see also in terms of identity formation, which is a key part to this in terms of masculinity, is that it's these online socializations that people can turn to when their direct human contact peers are not lifting them up in terms of their identity. They're not finding themselves through that. So what does that mean? That means that there's a lot of online groups. One of my students in my social problems class actually researched online hate groups, the rise of white nationalism in the United States. And it's rising through online groups. And we've seen it with other mass shootings that they live stream the mass shootings. And they're live streaming it to their communities. And you can think about, hey, they're doing it to these communities, but how powerful is that? They're live streaming it to a community of people who they've never met, yet they have a very strong affiliation to. And so with the rise of the internet as well, we see that people's identities, those that especially struggle with isolation and pressures to conform, are building their identities through online groups. Now, there are some positives, of course, not in this relation, but people building positive communities online. But in this case, we see the danger of that. Live streaming a mass shooting to a community of people you've never met that you have strong affiliations to. And so when we look at these profiles, we see that these are the common themes that we have. Mental health, severe mental health issues that are often untreated. Young men that have larger stigma in many cases to seek this out, easy access to guns. They learn from the previous incidents, they study them in a lot of cases, and then they're building their own identities through other institutions, particularly online. And so, wanted to end with this idea of solutions. And what I put here is just basically the talking points in the media of what we hear. Ban on certain guns, an age limit on certain guns, armed officers in school, and a reinvestment into mental health. And so for our discussion today, or if you want to stay in chat, what is missing from this list as we think about solutions to school targeted shootings? Did you want to? Yeah,
Sorry, I was just eager.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Well, give her the mic.
Oh, yeah.
I was just gonna say, organized community building among young men and boys. Opportunities for them to build community in physical proximity to one another that's location bound, and opportunities for them to be seen and heard.
Absolutely. That's a great one. I was going to open it up, so I'm glad you raised your hand right away. What else is missing? What are opportunities? I like to see solutions as opportunities. What other opportunities are out there? If we know that those are the main factors, what other solutions then could we have? Okay.
Just licensing and waiting periods.
Yeah, right. And that directly, you said licensing and waiting periods. And that directly impacts the easy access of guns, right? And so if we have waiting periods and ease of access, there was actually qualitative research with people that conducted mass shootings. And a large percentage of them said, and they picked it up basically the day before and then did the shooting. They said, if I had to wait, I have no clue if I would have done it. But it was such an emotionally driven response to attacking the institution. And so would the waiting period make a difference? And I think that's where, hopefully a reinvestment into research on gun policy and its effectiveness, we might be able to draw to that.
Investment in education.
So that's another one that often doesn't get talked about, and I'm glad you brought it up. Investment into education. There's a lot of ways that we can study what makes students successful in the classroom, and then, you know, hopefully that would lead to that. There's a lot of ways to invest in education. But if we actually look at research in terms of what are the best ways to invest in education, that can make a huge difference, because you are then potentially changing the relationship of the student with the school. And that would, right, hopefully eventually maybe decrease this rise in pattern that we see as well. And so there's a lot of ways to invest in education, but hopefully, yeah, that could lead to it. And so thank you for mentioning that. I see a lot of hands raised. We'll go here first.
You spoke much earlier about young men struggling in school. I don't believe that was separated out into a couple of the ways that they might struggle. One might be in the classroom, academically, intellectually. Another might be in socialization, and it could be either or both as well. And I wonder what data there is on that.
So you mentioned, you know, boys struggling in school, and so dividing that between academically and socially. Not a ton of data, but really what a lot of the data is outcome based. And what I mean by that is it's showing that men are, or young boys often are graduating with lower GPA, lower graduation rates, lower college graduation rates. And so a lot of it, because academic institutions are often outcome driven, which I think is problematic, won't get into that today, it's showing that. And so it's not actually looking at a lot of the root causes. But you mentioned socially, and a lot of this was probably more focused socially, but academically, if you're struggling academically and socially, that's what leads to that. That's what leads to the prison to pipeline, that your education to prison pipeline. That's what leads to basically the juvenile delinquency, people acting out. Of course, there's also family. I didn't mention family structure and family issues today. That can often lead to it, but there's no conclusive data that leads to it as well. Thank you for mentioning that.
Maybe this is related to that, but I was looking at reinvestment into mental health, and I'm not really familiar with how schools engage with students, or what do they have for services or counselors, or that's kind of a role that the school needs to be built to deal with.
So this is an interesting point to bring up, because it's similar in some ways when we think about law enforcement and how there's going to be changes in law enforcement and dealing with mental health incidents, and not totally trained in that area. And so different states have different policies in terms of that. I know when we look at the college level, that's where I'm at. We look at total number of students to counselor. And so they base how many counselors you need to have at each school based on your total students. I believe it's 1,100 to 1 is the number. So they're busy. If you want to buy a counselor lunch. Oh, so that is a great one. So do students drive it? There's a lot of steps in that. So like as teachers, if we see students are struggling with notice signs, we refer them to the counselor often, and that's one stop along the way. What I would love to see is every student meets with a counselor probably 4 times before they graduate, just to get that. I teach a lot of criminal justice and law enforcement students, and so I have activities where they go and talk to a counselor. It can be all positive, it can be whatever, but if they meet with a counselor while they're in school and they have an incident in their job, they're already familiar with going to a counselor. So that's why I do that, because that hopefully can lessen the stigma for officers, which is slowly reducing, which is good. But yeah, in terms of the steps, there's no necessarily requirement, there's no psychological test. There is for law enforcement to go in the field, but
well, we probably all know that our political system is broken. And I think one of the root causes of a lot of this is certain interest groups controlling the narratives. And also a lot of money going to the top, less and less money in places where it's really needed by children and families. And I'm not sure how this relates to mass shooters in particular, but I'm sure it relates to gangs and despair, and I could go on and on, but you know, I kind of like to go deeper and deeper, and I think part of it is the depth to which our political system has gone.
Thank you.
One thing I would love is if the school's role was more in teaching emotional intelligence instead of trying to hire counselors after the fact, after the damage is done.
Yeah, and that's a great in terms of emotional intelligence. I know at Vermilion, in communications, in outdoor leadership, sociology, we do talk about it. But yeah, you're exactly right in terms of teaching it instead of kind of this go to the counselor because you have a problem, instead of kind of more of like a positive psychology route of how do we actually lift you up from where you're at instead of you have a problem. Yeah.
How much of the socioeconomic, because mental health treatment is expensive, and if you've got to take your kid to the doctor for $200 or you can feed your family for a week, how much does the socioeconomic play into the shooters? Assuming that a rich family would get their child treatment and the poor one, where they go.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. And so social class is one of those things in terms of access. And so it's not a predictor in terms of violence, but it's a predictor in terms of access to mental health. And so yeah, when you level it out, that's probably the best way to phrase it. So I didn't talk a lot about social economic standing, but more in access to, do we have access to mental health? Because there are also some people that are in upper level socioeconomic standing who, as parents, don't support the notion of addressing mental health. And so that's where access can be limited if the parents aren't supportive as well. And that can happen at any socioeconomic standing. But thank you. Yeah, that's definitely an impact.
You can't live in Ely very long without hearing more and more stories about people, kids, young people whose lives were changed by going on an outward bound trip or a witchy trip. And so if the juvenile detention system had the money to not just refer a kid, but pay for it, so they actually went, that would be a great part of the solution.
Thank you for that.
I think we also forget that people turn 18 and the tap gets shut off. Our schools actually have some really amazing mental health help out there. Our local school has a counselor who's fantastic, who refers you up the chain to some really wonderful therapists. There's a ton of resources out there that schools are currently using. But once you turn 18, if you don't have the health insurance, you don't have the job, that tap gets turned off. If you don't go to VCC or a university, you become a welder or you do any other job, you may find that that tap and that structure to that mental health care is gone. And so I think we leave young people, not just students, in a real gap there while they're just navigating the adult world. And I think that's something that we could really look at.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because when you also look at statistics of shooters, and there's a rise of 18 to 20. And so they're no longer in that. And so even though our education system does have problems, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are systems in place actually when students are there. So even if they're misbehaving, even if they're, if a student doesn't go to school, everybody knows because they're absent. But when they graduate or if they drop out, all those systems are no longer in place.
One thing I don't see on this list is the background check piece. And I remember from your profile that past tendencies towards physical violence was one of the strong indicators. And I wonder whether you know, that's talked about a lot and disparaged a lot, the whole universal background checks. And so I wonder what you find in the data or in the narratives and why that would be such a controversial thing, because we also hear about, maybe not specifically the context of school shootings, but I think like mass shootings more broadly, there's strong correlation between the perpetrators having had past, for example, domestic violence reports and other things like that. And so where does the background check piece come into? Where does it conflict with privacy laws? Like, what do you find in your field in that realm?
I simply forgot to put it up there. Because that is one of the more popular proposed solutions. So right when you said that, I was like, yeah, that is standing up there. So that is, in terms of its success, again, I think, and this is where I like to be more data driven. Do I think it's successful? I'm sure that a lot of background checks are successful, and the universal background checks would be. I'll just show my hand there. The issue, of course, is do we have data? Do we have strong enough data that shows that it makes an impact? And that's what I wanted to show with those two cases of child protection and standard ground. And so now, hopefully, having some of these things lifted and investing more in terms of gun policy, we can get a more clear picture of universal background checks. How well do they work? And I think the key is universal, not state-driven, like more federal background checks. Having a standardized system that everyone uses, I think, would be more successful than states creating on their own, which and that will get pushed back, of course. Thank you all so much. And I love the discussion. I think that I hope that continues outside of here and doing more research. There are, you know, if I did a character profile and I really dive deep, it'd be about 25 slides worth of things. So and you know, family structure would start to appear, socioeconomic class would start to appear, all of those would begin to be there too. Those were just the larger predictors when we're looking at the case profiles. But certainly, when we look at gun policy, what guns are available, that could have an impact. We won't go into 2016 today. Maybe next summer we can. But this just does show that it is, when we talk about social problems, it's one that's getting worse. And so one thing that's really interesting is when we think about this, when gun violence was getting worse in the 90s, we had a bill that did that. And so we also saw that it led to mass incarceration. And so I guess my hope would be that when we look at increasing gun violence that's often related to mental health, that we don't take more of the criminal justice route, but we take more of a medical approach and increase our resources and reduce that. That would be my hope for solutions as well.
It looks like getting rid of men would help a lot.
You know, we could survey the room. There'd probably be some support there too. But you brought that up, and one concern actually. So older models of studying, you know, men and women and violence, we do see that violent crimes are increasing for women. Women are committing more and more violent crimes. And so as I talk about masculinity and driving this, if we don't slow it down, I wouldn't be surprised to see women enter the field of being more into mass shootings and school shootings as well, because we do see a large increase in women committing violent crimes as well. Whereas for many decades, that was not the case.
Thank you
So be careful.
Thank you, Tim.